Hey folks, welcome to the Ramble. So I just finished reading Sinclair Lewis's novel, It Can't Happen Here, and I wanted to talk about that for a little bit this time because that's a novel that a lot of people have been talking about in the last 2 years. When Donald Trump first began running for president, people started to notice similarities between the Trump campaign and the prospect of a Trump presidency and the story told in It Can't Happen Here. And having read the novel, I I totally get that, and I just wanted to talk about the novel a little bit and share my thoughts on it. The novel was written in 1935, and it depicts the establishment in the United States in 1936 and the years following of a fascist dictatorship. And the dictatorship is established by a man named Buzz Windrip, who is a United States senator who wins election fairly and legally and then immediately basically dissolves the government as it exists, completely ignores or sets aside the Constitution, and establishes a autocratic government. And he establishes what is eventually called the Corpo state, Corpo short for corporate, and that becomes the name of the Windrip regime, the corporate regime, or the Corpos. And that's all very interesting and very chilling, and it's all very well presented by Lewis, who is a fantastic writer. But the parts of the novel that really hit home, and the parts of the novel that are of most interest clearly to the author, and also are the parts from which the title is derived, are the depictions of the ordinary people of the United States and how they are reacting to Windrip as he is rising, as he is running for office, and then as he begins to institute all of these draconian measures, which eventually includes the establishment of concentration camps and of widespread, large-scale imprisoning of members of the population for non-crimes, for just perceived disloyalty to the Corpo regime. The main character in the book is a newspaper editor from a small northeastern town called Fort Beulah, and the editor's name is Doremus Jessup, and he is a typical sort of middle-aged, well-meaning, white, liberal, the kind of person that still exists and is still very common today, has a lot of faith in America, has a lot of faith in the American system, has a lot of faith in the judgment of the American people, and is fairly progressive, wants to see social reform, wants to see civil rights and all of these good things, but also has an innate faith in the system. And his journey through the story is one of being completely torn down and disillusioned when that faith betrays him. Those parts of the book are the parts that really hit home for me, because and I think a lot of us who are left-leaning, who are more leftist in our politics, but are not quite all the way on the left, are not quite socialists or anarchists or communists, but we lean that way. I think a lot of us would recognize ourselves in Doremus, because we still do have a faith in the system. We still do have a faith in the government and in the wisdom of the people. And when Trump was elected, we saw that faith invalidated, many of us. In my case, I think that was definitely what happened. I thought and even said things leading up to the election that Doremus Jessup says almost word for word in the novel, where he says things, when we're in the early parts of the novel, when they're leading up to the election, and Windrip has not yet been elected, but he's doing very well. His campaign is humming along. He seems very popular. His election looks like a foregone conclusion. And there's Jessup being questioned by his friends, saying, "Well, what are you going to do if he gets elected?" And he's very sort of reluctant to accept that that's going to happen. He says, "I just don't believe that the American people are capable of this kind of a thing. I just don't think that the American people would ever do anything so foolish. We're smarter than this. We're smarter than being bamboozled by some second-rate con man like this Buzz Windrip." And yet that's exactly what happens. People vote for Windrip en masse. That's one of the things that is not a parallel to the election of Trump. In the novel, Windrip is elected overwhelmingly It's like a landslide. And Trump imagines he was elected in a landslide, but actually nothing could be further from the truth. He lost the popular vote, and he only won the Electoral College fairly narrowly because he won 3 key states by a couple 10,000 votes. So Trump's election was not nearly the mandate that Windrip's was. But that refusal to admit the possibility, that refusal to see America as a kind of place where that sort of candidate would be elected, is presented in the novel as what allowed him to come to power in the first place. Good people, people who knew better, people who opposed that sort of thing, saw it happening and just kind of shrugged and said, yeah, but no, that's not going to happen. That kind of thing doesn't happen in the United States. We don't do that. That's a European thing. That's an Asian thing. They don't, well, not here. That's a Central American thing. We don't do that. We don't do that in the United States. We don't elect those kinds of people. And yet in the novel, that's exactly what happened. And in the United States in 2016, in reality, that's exactly what happened. We elected an authoritarian demagogue. We elected a fascist. And that is the word that I choose to use to describe Donald Trump. Fascist. Buzz Windrip, the character, was based on Huey Long. And if you know a little bit about the story of Huey Long and you read the novel, it's obvious. I mean, it's almost too on the nose. The rise of Windrip is paralleled almost exactly to the rise of Huey Long. And one of the reasons why Lewis wrote the novel in the first place was because he was very, very concerned about the prospect of Huey Long being elected president in 1936. And he wrote the novel as a way to sort of speak out against that and to warn against what could happen if a man like Huey Long were given presidential power. That didn't happen. It wound up not being the case because Huey Long was assassinated before the election and he never got close to the presidency. But Sinclair Lewis was very concerned about the prospect of a Huey Long taking power. And Buzz Windrip is a very, very close approximation of Huey Long, right down to the fact that his popularity is initially boosted by a popular radio broadcaster named Bishop Prang, who is, again, a very obvious analog of Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest, who was a major star on radio in the United States in the 30s and was a fascist, was a promoter of fascist policies, and was incredibly popular and incredibly influential, and then kind of went away after World War II. And I suppose you could draw a parallel between that and Trump if you wanted to. You could say that part of Trump's rise to the Republican nomination and ultimately the presidency was due not to him being embraced by any particular religious figures, because there aren't really any religious figures in the United States today that are comparable to Father Coughlin. There isn't a single religious broadcaster that holds that kind of sway, that kind of influence that Coughlin had in the 30s. But he was embraced, Trump was, generally by the religious right, despite his moral failings, despite his lack of ethics, despite the fact that he does not embody any of the principles that the religious right claims to value. They embraced him anyway as the nominee and as their best shot at getting a Republican president, because ultimately all they cared about is having someone in the White House who would sign their bills. And they were backing Pence as their guy. And they said, well, as long as, Pence is a theocrat, so as long as Pence is in the vice presidential slot, he can whisper in Trump's ear, and as long as Trump signs the bills we want him to sign, and as long as we get Roe v. Wade overturned, we're good. So you can draw a comparison between Windrip and Trump in that instance. But the closer parallels between the novel and the election and the presidency of Donald Trump are in more general terms. Windrip comes to power and comes to popularity in part by making extravagant promises to the people that we know he has no intention of even trying to keep. Trump did the same thing. Trump would make these extravagant, very generic promises like, we're going to make America great again, which I'll get back to in a second. We're going to bring back the jobs. We're gonna have winning in America again. We're gonna have so much winning in America that you're gonna get sick of it. You're gonna say, please, Mr. President, enough with the winning. And Windrip does the same thing. Windrip is depicted in the novel as doing the exact same thing, as pandering to people, as making a lot of promises, making a lot of contradictory promises, promising this group whatever it wants in exchange for its support, promising this group whatever it wants in exchange for its support. And the two promises are completely irreconcilable, but he doesn't care. He tells people whatever they want to hear. Windrip does make specific promises in a way that Trump doesn't really in reality. Windrip, for instance, says, if I get elected, then everybody gets $5,000 a year, which again is a Huey Long thing, because Huey Long didn't specifically promise everybody would get $5,000 a year. He didn't say, I'm going to send everybody a check for $5,000 if I'm president, but he said under his administration, everybody would be able to afford a brand new Ford automobile and $5,000 a year. And Windrip basically just says, I'll give everybody $5,000 a year. And then when he gets elected and takes power, all of a sudden, gee, we can't figure out where the money's going to come from. We can't afford $5,000 a year basic income for everybody. Sorry. But all the other things, like absorbing the Minutemen, his private army, into the United States military, and giving them uniforms and giving them weapons and consolidating his power and, building concentration camps all over all of the things that he needs to do or that he really wants to do. There's plenty of money for that. But the thing that he promised, the $5,000 a month, which is what got a lot of people to vote for him, it turns out we can't afford that. And we see something similar with Trump, where he puts himself out there as a fiscal conservative, as someone who wants to run the government like a business, and we're going to trim the fat, and we're going to make things run efficiently. And yet, if it's a pet project of his, money is no object. If it's the border wall, then we gotta pay for the border wall. Oh yeah, by the way, we're going to have to cut welfare. We're going to have to cut spending on public assistance. We're going to have to downsize all of these government services that people depend on. But the border wall, we got to find $20 billion for the border wall, please. There's a quotation that is often attributed to Sinclair Lewis that is actually probably a misquotation of something that was said by another author and lecturer in the 30s named James W. Wise, who said, when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the American flag and carrying a cross. And that's the fascism that Lewis depicts coming to America in It Can't Happen Here. And that is the fascism that has come to America in the form of Donald Trump. He did not promise to change America, to do something to America that had never been done before. He promised to make America great again. He was wrapped in the flag. There have been many times in public when he has actually hugged the American flag and kissed the American flag, because he's not subtle. He's not a subtle man. He's not capable of subtlety. I don't think he appreciates or even recognizes subtlety, Donald Trump. He's a very obvious person. He's a very loud, large, buffoonish person. And when he embraces the American flag, he just goes ahead and fucking does it. He just puts his arm around an actual flag. And that's what fascists do. When the Nazis rose to power in Germany, they painted themselves as being of Germany, as being genuine, authentic Germans, and of wanting to return Germany to a more authentic way. When Mussolini and the fascists rose in Italy, it was the same thing. They're going to make things the way they should be. We're going to return things to the proper order. And that is what Trump and his people are trying to do in the United States, and that's what Buzz Windrip and his fictional administration, his fictional regime does in It Can't Happen Here. And if you haven't read it, or you haven't read it recently, I encourage you to read it, and not to view it as a note-for-note prediction of the Trump administration, because it definitely is not that. That's one of the things about fascism, is that it doesn't happen the same way in every place. The fascism of Trump is not a Nazi. When people like me say Trump is a fascist, they jump up and say, how is he a Nazi? He's not a Nazi. Not literally, not actually. There are Nazis who are fans of his and are supporters of his, but Trump himself is not necessarily a Nazi, but he is a fascist. He's a different kind of fascist. He is an American fascist, not a German fascist, not an Italian fascist, not a Portuguese or a Greek fascist or a Spanish fascist. He's an American fascist. And people in the novel make exactly the same excuses for Windrip that people right now today make for Donald Trump. They say things like, well, I don't care about his personal life as long as he gets things done. I don't care about how loudish and brutish and uncouth he is as long as he gets things done, as long as he cleans up this mess. What we need is someone like that, someone who doesn't care what people thinks about him. I respect that about him. They say the exact same things about the fascist Buzz Windrip in the novel. People say that about Donald Trump in real life right now. People who voted for him and then come to regret it say things like, well, I didn't think he'd actually do that. I never thought that he would do this. How many times have we heard Trump voters expressing some level of regret in the last 2 years, saying exactly that, when the Republicans were attacking the Affordable Care Act, or when Republicans were, when Trump enacted the ban on Muslims entering the country, or when we were going through the heartbreak, which is still not over, by the way, of families being separated at the border and children being kept by themselves in separate detainment camps from their parents. And now we hear stories of parents being deported without their kids. And again, still ongoing, not over. We're not talking about it as much, but it is still going on. There are still children that are separated from their parents in U.S. custody right now. And when that started to happen and became a big news story, there were people who said, I just never thought he would do that. I just never believed he would actually do that. He said he would. He said he would get rid of the Affordable Care Act. He said he would impose tariffs. You know, he said he would do all of these things. And people voted for him because they said, yeah, I knew that that would be a bad idea, but I just never thought he'd actually do it. Obviously, the message of the novel is carried in the title, because even though the book is titled It Can't Happen Here, we probably recognize before we even open the book that that is ironic, because it can happen here. And the real lesson of the book is that in order for it to happen, we, the people, have to let it happen. That's how Windrip is able to take control in the novel. That's how Trump was able to get elected, because we allowed it to happen. We let it happen. We watched as it happened. And some of us, a lot of us, as it was happening, said, yeah, but it's not going to happen. And I was one of those people. I campaigned against Trump. I made videos against Trump. I voted for Hillary Clinton in the general election. I tried to encourage other people to vote for Hillary Clinton, to not vote for Donald Trump. But I never really believed that he was going to win. And I was wrong. And Doremus Jessup, the protagonist of It Can't Happen Here, was wrong. And he learns throughout the course of the novel just how catastrophically wrong he was. And the novel ends not with the corpo regime being toppled. It's not a fairy tale. It doesn't end with a happy ending where the fascists are brought down and democracy is restored. That's not where Lewis chooses to end the novel. Because when he was writing it, he was trying to motivate people to realize that it can happen here and to stop it from happening. And that's the same sort of motivation that we should take when we read the novel today. Lewis's message wasn't, oh, it can happen here, but don't worry, it might happen, but then everything will be fine by the end. His message was, it can happen here, and if it does happen, if we do allow it to happen, we have to fight back. And the end of the novel sees Doremus Jessup not free, not living in a country that has been liberated from the corpo state, from fascism, but living in a country where he and a certain group of people have decided to fight back, where he has been moved from his complacency. He has been moved from his apathy. His faith in the country has been shaken enough that he realizes that if I love this country and if I want this country to be maintained as a place where people can live and grow and be free, I have to fight back. I have to fight for this. I can't just sit on my ass and say, well, but I'm sure everything will be fine, because that sort of thing can't happen here. Sinclair Lewis was more prophetic than he probably realized, more prophetic than he probably was hoping he would be. Because in the person of Donald Trump, in the example of the Trump administration, we see that it absolutely can happen here. It's not happening exactly the same as Lewis describes it in his novel, but there are a lot of general similarities. And he got us exactly right. He nailed the people. He nailed our apathy. He nailed our complacency, our ignorance, our lack of imagination, our incredulity, our arrogant incredulity when we say, oh no, he's not going to do that. No, not in America, not to us. Those kinds of things don't happen in this country. That part Lewis got exactly right, because I don't think that has really changed since 1935, 1936. Despite everything we've been through as a nation and as a people, we still fall back to that mindset. It can't happen here, we say. And the fact that we say that is the number one factor that allows it to happen here. We say, no, that can't happen here. And that's why it does.